Hello and welcome back. In our last few videos, we saw how to send data over the network using our socket module. Now that we understand how TCP and UDP sockets work, let's expand on our TCP server client socket. In the next few videos, we will build on this idea such that our data can be sent from server to client and client to server repeatedly. Essentially, we're going to build a basic two-way chat that will take place via a terminal. So to begin, we're going to create two new Python files, and so I'll just come here and do file, new file. I'll set it as a Python file. I'll put a comment here. I'll say chat server side. All right, it's going to be our server side chat, and I'm going to save this still in my socket intro folder, and I'll just call it chat server. All right, and then I'll create a new file, new file, set it as a Python file, and I'll say client chat side. Chat client side. Perfect. All right, and I'll save this, as chat client. All right, wonderful. So I'm going to start with my server here. So the first thing that we're going to do is we will import the socket module. So import socket. And now what we'll do is, before, we were kind of like typing in our IP address, our ports, our encoders, maybe the maximum byte size. We were just mixing it all within our program. And I think it'll be better for us if we pull that information out and define them as some constant variables that we're going to use throughout the scope of our program here. So I'll say define constants to be used. So we'll start with our host IP address. So I'll say host IP, and so we're going to just get the IP address of our local machine. So socket.getHost by name, and then we'll pass into here socket.getHost name. All right, so now we have our host IP, and if we decide we want to change this later on, we can just come over here and override that command. Let's do something similar for our host port address. So we'll say host port, there we go, host port, and I'm going to pick that arbitrary value, 12345. You can use whatever value you want, right? Just make sure you're not using a port that a service is currently running on. Next, I'm going to define an encoder, and we'll define this as UTF-8. And we'll use this to encode and decode any of our information. And then lastly, I'll pick a byte size for our, our packages, our streams of information that are coming in, that's large enough so that we really don't have to worry about chopping off any of the message or anything like that. So I'll just say byte size. I can spell. Byte size is going to equal to 1024. Okay, perfect. So we've got those things defined. So now let's create our server socket using the socket module. And so again, we're going to set the socket to use the IPv4 and TCP protocols. So we'll say here, create a server socket. And so we'll say server. We'll call the server socket, and we'll call the socket module, and we'll call socket the socket method, and inside of here we'll pass socket.af_inet. There's IPv4, and then we'll do socket.sock underscore, all capitals, stream, and there's TCP. All right, perfect. And let's also, we'll say create a server socket, bind it to a IP port, and then we'll say and listen. We're going to do all three of these things right here. So we'll create the socket. Since we're now that the socket is created, we'll bind it to a location. So we'll say server socket. We'll call the .bind method, and in here we're going to pass a tuple, and that tuple will be the host IP and host port constant variables that we had defined earlier. And lastly, since we are using a TCP protocol here, TCP connection, we are going to listen for any incoming connections. So let's do that. So we'll say here, server socket.listen. Okay, perfect. So now what we can do is we can quickly print a message to the terminal informing the user that the server is essentially running. So this will kind of just be some visual feedback. And then once we're here, we'll also listen for any incoming connections. And if we get an incoming connection, we'll send a message letting the incoming client know that they have successfully been connected. So let's do that. So we'll say print, we'll just say accept any incoming connection, and let them know they are connected. So we'll give some sort of response back. So the first thing we'll do is we'll just print that the server is running. So that'll be visually for us on the server end. Oh, let me put that new line character inside of my string. \n. All right. Now that we have that, let's accept any incoming connection. So remember, when we accept an incoming connection, we're going to get two pieces of information. We're going to get the socket that is connecting to us, and we're going to get the address of that socket. So we'll call this our client socket, and we'll call it client address. We'll get those two pieces of information by calling our server socket, and we'll call the .accept method on the server socket. So it'll accept anything that connects to it and then store the information in these two variables, client socket and client address. Awesome. So now that the connection has occurred, we're going to send some information to the client socket to verify that they have successfully connected. So let's send some information to the client socket, which we have right here. So I'll call client socket, and we'll call .send. Recall, we don't need the send to like we did with UDP because we have a connection form, so we can just send right to through our connection channel, and we'll say you are connected to the server. ... Sure, and then I'll do \n for a new line. Now don't forget here, this is a string, and if we want to send information, we have to encode it and turn it into a bytes object, so I'll call .encode, and inside of here I'll pass my encoder constant variable, which is right up here. So far I think this is pretty good on our server side for our chat. I'm going to save this, and I'm going to come over to our client file. So right at the top here, I'm going to import socket, just like before. We got to make sure we bring in the socket module. And now let's also set some constant variables. So we'll say define constants to be used. This is just going to help us. I think it's a nice thing for us to do moving forward. So I'll have a destination IP address. And so for me, my destination IP is actually going to be the same as my host IP, right? We're on the same computer. So I'm just going to do socket.getHost by name and socket.getHostName. Okay, and I think later on, in a future video further along, I'll show you how to configure your router so that you can have connections coming in from different places and that sort of thing. But we're not there yet, so we're just going to do everything local on the same computer. Let's set up a destination port, so dest port, and we'll choose 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We'll do an encoder again, and our encoder is going to be UTF-8. We'll make sure that those are the same, and then we'll specify a maximum byte size of 1024. And again, we're not really worried too much about sending a message that's bigger than that at this point. All right, perfect. So now, once we have these things defined, let's create our client socket again, and we will connect to our server. So we're gonna kind of reproduce this section of code, but remember on the client side, we don't have to bind and listen. We're just gonna make a connection. So we'll say create a client socket and connect to the server. So in here, I'll call this client socket, and we're going to do socket.socket. All right, so we'll call the socket module and the socket method in here. We want to have it be IPv4, so socket.af_inet, and we want to follow TCP protocol, so we'll do socket.sock_stream. All right, so that creates the socket, and so now we have to connect to our server. So we'll call our client socket, which we just created, and we'll call the .connect method. And in here, we have to pass a tuple of where it needs to connect to. Well, it's going to connect to the destination IP that we specified and the destination port that we specified. So we can we can change these whenever we want to, and we'll alter where that connection is going. All right, awesome. So if we look here, I think this is maybe a good place to stop. If we run this, let me run my server first. All right, so server is running. That looks great. And if I run this, we just stop, right? We just stop. So the server has sent a message. I think the server has sent you are connected to the server. We're sending it, but we haven't yet received it here on our client side. But we'll work on that, I think, in the next video. This is a great place to stop. So what we now want to do is have the ability for both the client and server to send and receive information, essentially until one party decides to quit. And when we write that, that's where we'll get receiving that message here on the client side. So this is a great place to stop, and I will see you in our next video. Hello and welcome back. Our server and client scripts here for our basic kind of one-way chat are well on their way. So now let's actually work on adding that chat functionality. Let's start with the client side, since we are already sending a confirmation message on the server side to that client. So what we need to do is we need to essentially receive this message, decode it, and then display it. In fact, we're going to receive and decode and display all of the incoming messages, right? We want lots of these messages to happen. So what we can do is we can put this inside of a loop. So we'll use a while loop, and so we'll say while true, and I don't know, I'll just put a comment here. I'll say send and receive messages. All right, so while true, inside of here, the first thing that we'll do is receive the sent message, and we will decode it. So we'll say receive information from the server. So we'll just call this message. All right, we're receiving a message, and so we're going to get that by calling the receive method on our socket that we have here, client socket. So client socket.recv, and inside of here we have to specify the maximum size, the packet that's going to come through, and so we've declared that as byte size. And then we know that we also want to decode this message, so this is going to be a bytes object, and so I'm going to actually call .decode right here and pass in our specified encoder, and so I can receive and decode kind of all in one step here, and I think that's going to be really nice. So the next thing that we're going to do is we want to have the ability for a user to essentially end the program, right? And so we're going to check to see if the message that was sent was the string quit. And if it was, we are simply just going to end the chat. And we'll sort of use this string as a kind of like a flag to indicate that the chat is done. However, when one party receives a quit flag, they should also send a quit flag back to the other party to sort of validate that they are quitting and to start the quit process on the end of the communication channel. So let's see. Let's see how we might do this. We'll say quit if the connected server wants to quit. Else, keep sending messages. So we'll come down here, we're going to check the value of message. So if message is equal to the string quit, then what are we going to do? Well, we said that we should probably send a quit flag back to the server to verify that we're going to start the quitting process. So we'll say client socket dot send. So we're going to send, and what are we going to send? Well, we're going to send the quit flag right back, and we're going to encode this using our encoder so that we can send it through our socket here. And then let's just print a message here for our own purposes. I'll do on a new line, so \n, I'll say ending the chat ... Goodbye. Awesome. And then I will call a break statement to break out of the while loop. Perfect. Now, if the message isn't quit, then what should we do? Well, we'll have an else block here for our if statement. Well, we should display the message, right? So let's do that. We'll say print, and I'll use an f string here to have a new line, and then I'm going to print the value of the message that we received. All right, perfect. So that looks like it's going to work out quite nicely here. And so now what do we want to do? Well, inside of this while loop, once we get the message, we then want to get the client to put in some information that we can send back to the server. So let's do that. So we'll come over here and we'll create or override our variable message, and we'll call the input function, and we'll put a prompt here where it'll just say message. And so whatever the user types in will then be put into our variable message, and then let's send that value back to the server. So to send it, we'll call client silent client socket.send, and then we'll send message, but we know we have to encode this, so we'll call the encode method, and we'll pass in our given encoder. All right, I think that's pretty good. The last thing that I'm going to do here on the client side is, if we break out of this infinite while loop, I am going to just simply we'll close the client socket. So if we've quit, then we'll break out of here, and I will say close the client socket, and we'll just call client socket.close. All right, and I'm going to save this because I think our client socket, our chat client, is pretty much done. So let's head over to the server side and let's take a look at what we have to do here. So we want another infinite while loop. So we'll put a comment here. We'll say send/receive messages. Okay, and we'll start with the while loop. So while true, we're going to do something really similar here. So we're going to check to receive a message from the client socket, making sure that we state, the maximum byte size in our encoding method. So we got to get some information. So we'll say receive information from the client. So we'll call this message, and we'll call the client socket, which we have gotten here when we accepted that connection. We have that client socket. Perfect. So client socket dot recv receive, and we'll specify our byte size that we had defined, byte size, and then we'll decode it, decode, and pass in the encoder that we have defined. Now that we have that message, we're going to do something, almost identical to what we had before. So we're going to say quit if the client socket wants to quit, else display the message, we'll just say. So if the value of message is equal to that string quit, what are we going to do? Well, we will acknowledge the fact that we received a quit flag, and we'll send one back. So I'll say client socket.send quit.encode using our encoder. So we'll encode that string as a bytes object, and then we'll print our message here. On a new line, we'll say ending the chat ... goodbye. All right, and then I will break out of my while loop. Now, otherwise, else. So if the message is quit, we'll end the chat. Else, what are we going to do? We're going to print the message. So we'll follow the same formatting. I'll use an F string here. I'll put a new line, and then we'll print the value of whatever that message was, and then we'll override that variable message by getting some input from the server here. Input, and we'll just say message. And then once we have that new message to send, we are going to send it to our client socket. So client socket.send, and we'll send message, but of course we have to encode that string using our encoder. All right, the last thing that we'll do, just like before, once we break out of the while loop, we'll simply close the socket by calling server socket dot close. So we'll close our server socket that we had originally created over here. All right, so I think this is all set. Let's test this and see how this works. Hopefully we should be able to kind of have like a two-way chat going on here. So server is running. We can say client is running. And so if we look here, our client says you're connected to the server, and I'll say, hi server, this is client. And I'll hit enter, and if we come back over here, we got hi server, this is client. We can say, how are you client? And send it, and it looks like that message is coming through. How are you client? I am good. You. We'll send it, and then let's see what happens if we type quit. Quit. We'll just say quit. All right, and it says ending the chat, goodbye, and then over here we've got ending the chat, goodbye. So it looks like this is working perfect. So you might not like having to go, back and forth here. So one of the things that we can do is if I just minimize this and I go to the directory where I've got these files. All right, here they are. So I'm going to just come in here. I'm going to right click and I'm going to open in terminal. All right, so here we are. I can type in Python, and we'll type, what did I call this? Chat server. Yep, so I'll type on Python chat server.py, and there it is. Server is running, and so now I'll do something similar. I'll open in terminal. And here I can type in Python chat client.py, and so now I can run them in separate windows, and we can kind of see that the same thing is happening. So we can say, hey, what's going on? All right, and then there it is. Nothing. What's going on? Going on with you? And so we're getting that back and forth. So just another way that we can run this, and we'll pass the quit flag again, ending the chat, goodbye, ending the chat, goodbye. Awesome. So this has worked out really nicely. We now have, a nice little program here. Maybe we can put one of these, the server script on one computer on your home network, the client script on another computer on your home network, and you just have to adjust. Let's just see. You just would have to adjust on the chat client right here, your destination IP. So, right, if your server, I think I'm running on 192.168.1.7 is my IP address. So your server is going to get their own IP, but then your chat client, you just have to change it. So maybe if you were running this on like 192.168.1.15, you would just type that. You could just type that IP address in right here. All right, I think this is a great place to stop. This kind of gives us a really nice overview of some of the functionality of the socket module. I think one of the next things that we'll probably do is try to build on this idea of the chat, a chat room. Right now, we can only have one client essentially connect to our server. If we try to have more than one client connect to our server, I think we're going to have some issues. So, for instance, if I'll run my chat server and my server is running, and then I come over here and I run my client. Okay, so this is great. We'll just say this is great. All right, and so that went through. Yes, it is. But let's see what happens if I try to run another client. So I'll come over here, I'll open in terminal, and I'll run Python chat client. You can see that it just hangs here because once we have our connection, we're not allowing other connections to happen, right? If we come back over and look at our code here for the chat server, our connection, where are we accepting our connection? We're accepting the connection here outside of this while loop. And so the next thing that we'll look at is how do we handle having multiple connections on our server so that maybe we could have not just one person connect, but 2, 3, 4, 5 people all connect, and we can facilitate a chat between multiple people. So that's where we're headed. We're going to need to use another module or another library to help us accomplish that, but I can't wait to begin looking at that with you in our next video. I'll see you then.